So robotic process automation is very suitable to automating repetitive processes. However, when we look at organizations, you will notice that there are lots and lots of processes going on in an organization at any given time. It's important that we realize what processes are most suitable to be automated by means of robotic process automation. It's also important to keep in mind that when we have complicated processes that go through the entire organization, usually one specific individual only has view on a part of this process. So when your robotic process automation is just based on individual robots, you might not necessarily be able to automate the process end to end. One thing we'll realize later in this course is that most organizations use what we call a grassroots approach, in which multiple individuals have different robots that they apply on an individual level. So they take their part of the process and automate that by means of a robot that they program themselves. However, most organizations also take a top-down approach. Usually this is done by a center of excellence where robotic process automation experts are located, and they create large robots that can oversee entire processes, and they focus on automating processes end to end. Now let's explore what type of processes are best suited to be automated by means of RPA. First of all, it's important to realize that the robot likes nothing more than repetitive processes. For a human, it's very boring to do the same thing over and over again, but robots excel in this. So when we take, for example, this graph, where on the one axis we have the effort and on the other axis we have time, let's say we have the time we spent on normal processes and the time we would spend by creating a robot. Now if you have a process that is not very repeatable and only happens every once in a while, in that case the total amount of time spent on this process is not really all that much in total. However, if we create a robot, initially that will take us quite some time to set up. We need to look at the process and analyze it, and we need to program the robot. And usually, down the line, you will also have a little bit of maintenance on the robot. So when we take the time that it actually takes to create this robot, and then we look at how many times this process will be repeated, in this case, it doesn't really make for a good business case to apply RPA to this specific process. However, there might also be a process that is repeated many times throughout its entire life cycle. In this case, the total time spent on this process might be significant. If we apply the building of a robot on top of that process, then we get a different calculation. And in this case, it might be very suitable to apply RPA to this process. So when we look at the type of processes in which you could apply RPA, you should definitely look for repetitive processes. Another item you want to take into consideration are processes that take a long time to execute. For instance, there might be a lot of waiting time or errors involved in this specific process. If these processes take so long but are easily automated, in that case, your calculation would look something like this. The process might not be repeated that often, but creating the robot might still be beneficial in this case. A good example here is when the robot searches through multiple pages of documents to look for specific information. When a human has to do this work, it can be very time-consuming. But if you can easily plan a robot to do so, that might be a significant time saver for you. So, we also want to look at time-consuming processes to automate. Then the viewpoint we want to take into consideration is that robots like to have business rules and logic in order to operate, while we humans are better at abstract concepts. So you want to apply robotic process automation in processes that have a lot of business rules in them, while it might not necessarily be feasible to apply robots for subjective decisions. So rule-based processes can definitely be automated. However, subjective processes that require some sort of judgment to be done by a human might not necessarily be very suitable for RPA. But also, when we compare software robots with artificial intelligence, you will notice that software robots have a better time handling structured information, while machine learning and artificial intelligence are better with unstructured data. So that's also a differentiator with regards to processes that are suitable for automation by RPA. One thing to also consider, when we use macros to automate processes within applications, that can be a very suitable solution. However, one of the strengths of RPA is that it mimics humans, and they usually work in multiple applications, and so will the software robot. So processes that are executed in multiple systems are usually also good candidates for RPA automation. And the last thing you want to look for in your processes are processes that might be very easy to execute, but are very error prone. If an error occurs within the process, it usually takes a long time to execute because you have to put certain safeguards in place. So if you look at a process like this, that usually takes a short time, but if there is an error it takes a long time to execute, that this also might be a suitable candidate for robotic process automation. When we look at the totals, it might look something like this. We have multiple small iterations of this process, but also some pretty lengthy ones. In that case, it might be a good business case to apply a software robot. So you also want to look at processes that are error prone. Now, in order for this list to be complete, we will also have to look at some examples of things that are not feasible for RPA. An example of a process that you don't want to use robotic process automation for is a process that is constantly changing. Then the graph would look something like this. We create the robot, and after 4 iterations of the process changes and we have to create another robot. This type of process you see a lot in legal environments where the law changes every so often. In this case, it can be very tricky to keep programming robots based on business rules if they constantly change. Then after a couple of iterations of the process, again we have to change the process and we have to change the robot. And in the end, when we do the calculation, we might have a lot of iterations of the process that we automated, but it also will take a long time to keep these robots up to date because the business rules are constantly changing. So in short, it might not be very feasible to have a very changeable process be automated by software robots. And to close out this list of things not to automate, it's also physical products. In robotic process automation, we are talking about software robots and not physical robots that, for instance, can move boxes around in your organization. Obviously, there are solutions that can do this, but that is not within the scope of robotic process automation. So this list is a good basis that you can use to assess whether or not the process you have in front of you is actually suitable to be automated by means of a software robot. I will add an overview of typical processes and industries in which software robots are applied. You can find this in the learning material added to this course. But besides automating specific processes, there are also other use cases for RPA. So let's take a look at those in the next clip.